KFSR and CMAC present the Central Valley Ledger, a public affairs program featuring stories from all over the Central Valley with Sevag Tateosian, 90.7 KFSR.
I'm your host, Sevag Tateosian. Welcome to the beautiful Community Media Access Collaborative Studios in downtown Fresno. Our guest this week on the Central Valley Ledger is Lt Col Shepard. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Likewise, likewise. So before we talk about this Civil Air Patrol, I want to get to know you a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, wearing this blue uniform, been doing that for a very long time. I was actually pretty much born in the Air Force. My father was a senior master sergeant, not an aviator, but in communications. And in high school, I actually knew nothing about Civil Air Patrol. I got involved with the Air Force. I went to Air Force ROTC.
You know, and throughout this interview, you're going to say some things that I'm going to get excited about, and I may interrupt you. I apologize early on because you were in high school and you heard about this program.
No, I knew nothing about it in high school.
And then?
But I went on to Air Force ROTC because I wanted to fly. I had been watching those jets take off into the sunset for a lot of years. I always wondered, wow, man, I wonder if I could do that. And I did get the opportunity to do that for all too brief years. You know, 20 years just goes way too fast.
Well, and the reason why I stopped you, because I know that the opportunity for people to join the Civil Air Patrol is available for our youth. How early can someone join the Civil Air Patrol?
We accept youth, male and female, from 12 to basically 18. You can stay a cadet at 19 and 20 if you've already, been in. But to work the full program and get the full benefit of it, it does take a few years. There's a lot of things to learn, a lot of things to do, and incredible opportunities that these cadets have that can help them wherever they go in their life, whether they choose a military career or another direction. The things that they learn from Civil Air Patrol will stick with them and serve them really well.
So I want to go back to, you're in high school, then you join the ROTC, and then what happens? Was there pressure on you to join because of your father, or?
No pressure. No pressure, but you know, that desire to fly had certainly been there. You know, I was one of those kids who wanted to make models, and they didn't have the cool radio control models so much then. You flew them around on a wire, which was definitely not as cool as you can do these days. They have some amazing flying models now. But that interest in aviation was there at a very early age. One of our family friends, Bob Brown, who unfortunately died way too young, helped, pique that interest. I was, call him Air Force brat, still in elementary school, at Ramey Air Force Base in Puerto Rico when they were flying B-36s out of there. And for people who've never heard of B-36, this is a 10-engine bomber.
Pretty big plane.
It had 6 pusher props, the largest recip engines that were ever built, and 4 jets. And this thing was huge. And as a kid, I actually got to go in one, and they had a crew of 10, just a massive size airplane. I couldn't figure out how something that big could possibly fly. And yet somehow it did. But the more exciting thing that I saw the first time at Ramey Air Force Base, well, I saw the Thunderbirds fly way back when they were flying some of the early jets, the F-84. And that had to be just the coolest thing in the world. And you know what? Just about 5 weeks ago, had some cadets over at the Salinas in the International Air Show there and watching the Thunderbirds still fly. And it's still pretty much the coolest thing in the world.
Yeah, it sounds incredible. It sounds like a great experience for them. So you joined the ROTC, then when did you actually fly your first plane?
Well, I was fortunate. I went to Miami University of Ohio. And
Not of Florida.
And we were founded in 1802. And Miami of Florida was nothing but a swamp. So we got about a century on them easily. But somehow they get better PR. But fortunately, Miami University had its own airport and its own flight instruction program. So I basically had a scholarship through ROTC. So I got my private license there back in 1968. So you've been a lot of years ago.
You've been flying
nearly 48 years.
When I heard that, we were talking off air, when I heard that, so many questions came up. Number one, technology in these airplanes. I mean, I want to take you back to the first airplane that you flew, to the latest airplane that you flew. Tell us a little bit about the differences in technology, because I've driven a car. When I first drove a car, it was back in the late 90s, and I drive a car now, and it's much different. I imagine airplane is going to be different.
Well, partly true, and partly much is the same. I mean, the basic physics of flight, well, that hasn't changed at all. The basic way that internal combustion engine functions or a propeller functions, that's physics. That's the same. What has really changed is the avionics or the electronics of it. We have things in our aircraft today. Our squadron does have its own airplane. It's a Cessna 182 turbo, what's called turbo normalized, so we can climb right up to 15,000 feet without too much worry, except we'll need to put on some oxygen, of course. But the big change is in avionics. Our system is called a G1000 for the Garmin, and it gives a really nice screen for the pilot, gives him just about all the information that he needs, and then right next to it is the multifunction display that can give us all kinds of information, and a moving map display. It does a terrain proximity warning. We can call up a checklist if we want. We can get weather information if we want. There's an auxiliary page that does half a dozen other things, and this is just all, you know, we're flying computers. We're flying all these computers that back at the time, you know, the space shuttle was still flying. Well, computers were important then, but they were still huge. Now, all of us have more computer power in our pocket, in our phones, than the space shuttle had in probably, they had computer redundancy, and our cell phone has more computing power than all of the computers that were carried aboard those space shuttles.
And it's going to be interesting to see where technology goes in the next 100 years when it comes to flight. Tell us a little bit about flight safety. Now, sometimes we hear that some of these little planes have crashed, and so people may say, oh no, flying is dangerous, flying is dangerous. You've been doing it for a very long time. What are your thoughts on flight safety?
Well, I've also been a safety officer for a long time too. So this is something that I've given a lot of thought to. And through the years, the most consistent problem in aviation has been poor decisions.
By the
pilots
operator.
making poor decisions. And so recently the FAA is trying to change the training. They're trying to put more emphasis on what we call ADM, or aviation decision making. You know, both for the new pilots, the trainee, and then trying to get older pilots to also consider this. And that's something that actually we've been doing in Civil Air Patrol for many years now. The whole idea of risk management and how do you minimize those risks. So hopefully still get the mission done, but you know, without losing more people or planes.
When does a pilot know when there's danger? I mean, is it your gut, or how does that work?
Well, that probably is very individual. But if you're having to wonder and hearing that little voice, is this really the right thing to do? Chances are it's not. You know, it's time to find a place to land. There's an old saying in aviation that it's much better to be sitting on the ground and wishing you were in the air than in the air and praying that you can get back on the ground.
So, and that brings up another question, because I've always wondered this. When you're up in the air and there's turbulence or there's something that you're saying, you know, I need to land this plane, how do you know where the nearest airport is? Because I imagine some of these cities have airports that we've never heard of.
G1000 to the rescue. There's a little button called Nearest, and then it'll pop up a little menu, and it'll give you probably the 6 nearest airports. And depending on how critical your situation is, on fire would be the most critical. Then you'll take whatever you can get, or even a farmer's field, because if you're unlucky enough to be on fire, you just really need to get it on the ground before pieces start falling off.
Can you tell us a story of when you had a dangerous situation, if any, and how you combat that?
Well, actually, very recently, I said I was up on that search 2 weeks ago on Monday. Well, on Tuesday, I was returning to that. At least that was the intention. Very same airplane, an engine that was relatively new, and 1,400 hours on it or so. That's not an old engine. And right on takeoff, about 150 feet above the ground as we were climbing out, fortunately I had an instructor pilot, very experienced guy with me, Chris Muir, and he said, you just lost your number 4 cylinder, because we also have an engine analyzer with this G1000. So we can see what each cylinder is doing, and that's 150 feet in the air, you know, climbing out. He says, you just lost your number 4 cylinder. And so I immediately knew I wasn't really going anywhere, looked at the end of the runway and said, if I try to put it down now, I'll probably be in the fence, and decided now then to bring it around. And so I leveled off at about 300 feet, which is actually fairly low for flying, and called the tower and said, we got some engine trouble and we'll be coming back for immediate landing. Declined the fire trucks because I was definitely not planning on crashing. Probably that would have not been a bad idea, but taking off on 29 right, and 300 feet, and I got the best glide speed in case the rest of it failed. Turned very easily around, because the last thing you want to do is stall at low altitudes, and made a really nice landing on 11 right, going the opposite direction. I was very fortunate in that there was not much traffic right then that morning, nor was there much wind, so it didn't make too much difference that I had a very slight tailwind. And also the good thing after that was our aviation mechanic is right there next to the tower. So I just taxied in, shut it down, and found out we had an oily mess in the engine. And took a deep breath and this is a beautiful day to be alive.
Well, and we're glad you made it safely. So this brought up another question, mechanic. You said there's an aviation mechanic there. So how frequent should you be checking or maintaining the airplane? Because, you know, we know in a car, if it's not driving good, we're going to check the tires. If it's past 3,000 miles, or if you're using synthetic, 5,000 miles, but don't quote me on that, then you go to the mechanic and get your engine oil changed.
Okay.
With the airplane? With
an aircraft, what the rules say, there's a 100-hour check, and then there's an annual check. There's also what they call a mid-cycle oil change. So you change the oil at 50 hours. This is hours on the engine. So yeah, there is definitely regular maintenance. And then these reciprocating engines, most of them get thorough inspected, breakdown, and overhaul at 2,000 hours. So ours was way short of that 2,000 hours. We probably had another 2.5 or maybe even 3 years to fly before we would come up for that. But
it happens.
I'm sure it's been well inspected now. We're still waiting for the parts to get back so they can put it back together, and then we can test fly it and get back to business.
Fresno Air Terminal. It's a smaller airport, we have the word international in it because technically we do have some flights that go into Mexico.
Correct.
So it is, by definition, an international airport. What are your thoughts on that airport? I mean, if I'm a beginner, is it a good spot for me to be practicing?
It depends on the time of day. There are times during the day when they have a lot of business, and quite frankly, the little guys, if you're doing 70 miles an hour in final, and the jet behind you is doing 140 knots, it doesn't work well. That doesn't work well. So to do just VFR patterns, we'll go over to Chandler, or they'll go over to Madera. But there's other times of day when the business is relatively slack, and it would not be a big problem to be in the pattern. And it's also important for new pilots to, you always think about, oh, you got to learn how to fly the airplane, but you know how difficult it is for some people to learn how to talk on the radio. And if you've only been flying at small airports that have no tower, no approach control, then you get intimidated when you actually have to fly into one that has that. And of course, once you learn how to do it, like everything else, once you learn how to do it, well, it's easy. But we call them with student pilots when they press the button to talk on the radio, so they get a tongue stall when they go when their mind just totally went blank. And so I think it's important for new pilots to definitely spend some time working with ATC so they are comfortable and competent to do that. But be considerate, Don't be 70 miles an hour when you got airliners lining up behind you on commercial. That's not a good time for you to be there.
It sounds like the vehicle that's on the freeway that's driving extremely slow, holding up traffic behind them. Tell us a little bit about some of the emblems that you have on your jacket. You were with the Air Force, retired. Tell us a little bit about what some of those emblems are that you have.
Well, one shows, I guess one of the simplest ones, marksmanship, and one is just a service ribbon. We've got have Air Force commendation medals just for doing, this or that for the Air Force and for the Air National Guard, because I actually finished up my career here in Fresno in the 144th Fighter Interceptor Wing. But the ones on top here, those are air medals, and that's for flying combat over North and South Vietnam. And I had 39 missions over the north and more than 100 missions over the south. And in the 1972, when towards the end of the war, when Nixon was putting on the pressure to get the North to sign the Paris Peace Accords, and eventually they did sign. But then after Nixon's resignation, and we withdrew, then they systematically just violated every single thing that they had just agreed to. When anyone says how we lost in Vietnam, it's not the military that lost in Vietnam. We stopped the North Vietnamese from taking the South. We got them to sign the Paris Peace Accords. But because of the political situation and because of legislation that Congress had passed, that we would not go back in.
Why is the Air Force a good branch to get into? If you have someone that maybe may not know what they're going to do in the future, they love airplanes. I mean, I guess the better way to ask the question is, what makes the Air Force different from the other military branches?
Well, used to be able to say, well, we have more technology, but the Navy's got plenty of technology. The Army has got, they're catching up with technology. And actually, I would have to say it depends on what you want. If you think, getting the sea breeze in your face is a really cool deal, then you want to go Navy or even Coast Guard. And if you're really interested in flying helicopters, Well, the Army's got more helicopters than anybody else. Air Force does have a few helicopters in special operations and rescue operations, but the Army has far more helicopters. So if that's what you want, then that's the way you would want to go. So Air Force, if you look at the entire spectrum of what can be done through the air, we have the fullest spectrum, from space to the unmanned vehicles, the Reapers and the Global Hawks, that have been coming more and more important as the technology of warfare has evolved. So Air Force, highly technical. Somebody that wants to be in the Air Force, you need to graduate from high school. In the old days, when people used to think, I don't like school, so I'll just join the military.
Not so anymore.
No, the military doesn't need people who can't learn well, because to advance in the military, you'll be going to many schools. Mm-hmm. And you'll need to be flexible, you need to be adaptable and learn not just to deal with the technical issues of the systems, but you're also going to be dealing with people all over the country. Military is a great way also to kind of break down parochialism. If you've never been out of your county, you never dealt with people from New York or Washington State, or you're going to have that opportunity. Or even for Indian reservations, many Native Americans have joined and served really well in the military. So it's definitely been a vehicle since Truman desegregated the military after World War II. I think that came out around 1948. So the military is one of the first institutions in this country to be desegregated.
We are running out of time this week on the program. I promise we're going to get to Civil Air Patrol in the next edition of the program. Tell us a little bit about, if I joined the Air Force today, how long will it take me to actually be up in the air in my own airplane, or if you can call it your own airplane? How long will it take me to be up in the air?
To get a pilot training slot is very competitive. One, you got to have the eyes for it. You have reflexes for it. There'll be a written test. There'll be a written test, so you have to do all these things. And if you get a pilot training slot, undergraduate pilot training lasts 52 weeks. And get past that, you usually get your selection for which airplane you're going to go to based on your class rank. So that's the way that usually goes. And then when you get to the aircraft you're actually going to be flying and serving in, depending upon the complexity of the mission, you might have as little as 90 days training in that aircraft, or that may go on for as much as another year. And of course you'd be flying during that time. And but there are many jobs that have to be done to, even for a single pilot airplane, to get in the air.
And it sounds like it depends on the person. If you excel, you do well in the school, then you'll climb faster, or you'll get to the end result, which is flying faster. Well, if that's your end result, I mean, that's not what everyone wants. We have some cadets that are interested in the legal profession. Others might be interested in medical. And one of the great things about the military these days is, in this day of very high tuition costs, there are scholarships available. And if you're awarded that scholarship and say you go to law school for 3 years, you pay that off by your service. We would owe 6 years of service. Meanwhile, you would be an officer, you'd be getting full pay and allowances while you serve your country. So I think it's a fantastic deal if you're able to get that school that you want. So for some, flying's it, but for others, they may want to run satellites. We have 19 and 20-year-olds in Colorado
who are airmen who are controlling satellites
Interesting.
for Space Command.
Lieutenant Colonel Shepard, appreciate it. We are out of time this week, but we're going to come back to the Civil Air Patrol. Thank you for joining us this week. We'll be back for part 2 shortly.
Okay. Well,
That's all for this edition of the...
That was a fast 27 minutes.
It was, sir. That's all for this edition of the Central Valley Ledger. I'm your host, Sevag Tateosian. Our guest this week was Lieutenant Colonel Shepard. He is with the Civil Air Patrol. Thank you to the volunteer crew that make us look and sound good each week. We're recording this week out of the Community Media Access Collaborative Studios in beautiful downtown Fresno. Thank you to those of you watching on Comcast 93 and AT&T 99, and to those listening to 90.7 FM, KFSR Fresno. Tune in for part 2 of this 2-part series coming up next week.
KFSR and CMAC present the Central Valley Ledger every Sunday morning at 11:30. For a complete program schedule, visit kfsr.org.